A clear alternative. Are they using tips from Lucifer to organize America and the world? Well, in Saul Alinsky's book, which he dedicated, by the way, to Lucifer, Rules for Radicles, he shares 13 tactics those who organize in darkness use. His 12th tactic says the price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. This is about pushing a bipolar narrative and getting a buy-in. And we discuss how this tactic was used in the 1960s and 70s and how it was used so many times against our government and against the right form of government. But by the way, it pushed so hard in the 60s that now in the 70s that we had over 50+ million children aborted because of that narrative being approved called abortion. Well, listen, we're going to talk about that and the positive light response. Check it out. Be sure to subscribe and press alert to get new notifications of new success secrets made available on VFN TV. We're talking about the 13 tactics. The 13 tactics taught by Saul Alinsky. It's a book that's dedicated to Lucifer in the front and Barack Obama before he was president in the back and Hillary Clinton. And we've been bringing these 13 tactics up, and I'm so excited to know that we are going to be, we got the 12th one and then the 13th, and we're done. But what we're doing is we're sharing the light alternative to that, the LIGH alternative to understand. So many people just see a dark tactic being brought against them, you know, the organizers of the night, you know, coming in and bringing something against them. And because they don't have the light of God's word, 97% are not reading God's word in the context of what's going on according to George Barna. 81% are not even picking up their Bibles, so that you don't have a light perspective of anything that the enemy wants to organize against you in darkness. So we're trying to bring that to you.
Yeah.
So we're bringing the word to you, and it's the hearing of the word that brings faith. And so I say that because even in the midst of why we're bringing this, the George Soros, the organizer of the world, is bringing in at a Soros-funded group plans conservative fly-in to get House to vote for amnesty in regards to he's coming from another country. He's renounced being a Jew. He's a Jew, but he's renounced being a Jew. He made his money off crashing countries' economies, and he you know ever how the deviance works. And he says the European Union needs to be eased down, and it's already going down. Needs to be eased down, and then you have the American economy, which we've talked about over and over again, and you know, I sure hope that it doesn't happen in the context. But at $50,000 for this baby who was just born, he already owes $50,000. It's pretty much, and they're like on the spending spree. They're spending on spend. I mean, we just bought a $700 million website who doesn't work. Can you imagine? Can you imagine?
Dude,
Hey, by the way, for those that it doesn't cost that, you know, it's just, and they hire Canadians to come and do it. They got fired from Canadian anyway. But remember, we learned about in 13 tactics taught by Alinsky, which Hillary Clinton did a paper on, which the president taught for 4 years himself. You have to understand that really doesn't matter, because remember, we talked about this, and one of the tactics was you have to have a viable alternative. You have to have a viable alternative. As a matter of fact, that's today's tactic. Amazing. It's perfect timing. The 12th tactic of Alinsky's 13 tactics, which the president taught for 4 years on the payroll of Alinsky, which Hillary did a sealed thesis on in her college, and we haven't read to this day, who is reportedly, according to her network, MSNBC, that they're going to be
her network.
They report that she's going to be running for president coming up soon.
Oh yes.
It could be just governor of the Amero, you know. Anyway, so this is the 12th of the 13 tactics. This is the tactic Alinsky wrote when he was in prison, how to organize, in a book that he dedicates the first one who did this to Lucifer. And this is the 12th one that he writes about. And it's interesting, he chose to write 13 of them. And this is the tactic. The price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. I mean, think about that. You know, each of these tactics, and you can hear them all in the context, but I'm not going to cover them all. The price of a successful attack, when you're organizing against when you're polarizing a people, and organizing the ones you polarize to be able to cause conflict, to force the ones you polarized against to do what you want them to do, authority, when you rebel against authority, which we talked about Korah and all the crews. You got to have a viable, you got to have some sort of, the price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. This makes so much sense because everybody couldn't understand when Alinsky's children, people who followed Alinsky's teachings, were going, well, we haven't read the bill yet, but we need to vote for it before we read it. All they had to have was a constructive alternative. Everybody's all caught up in the actual alternative. You're trying to define the alternative. There never is with Lucifer. It's just something else. You got to have something else because remember we talked about on the previous tactic was you have to get the buy-in. You have to get the buy-in because God's created you in the image and the likeness of himself, and you, when you get unified and you buy into a narrative, good or bad, light or dark, Tower of Babel or the kingdom of God, things begin to come to pass. So they have to get you. I mean, Hitler had to get a buy-in to the Nazi party for the people to begin to just break loose on God's folks there. And so, so then, in regards to having to have the buy-in, the narrative, and we talked about they push bipolar narratives. In other words, you have the right narrative, what God is saying, what's right, and then you have the bipolar narrative they push. It's totally opposite. So you got to remember this. When it's Lucifer doing it, he's about to take you away from something's good. He's about to take you away from something awesome. I mean, for example, in the 50s, the women in America are some of the blessed women that ever been on the face of the earth. If you look at all the women that ever existed and the life they had to live, and how food was acquired and how water was acquired and how family was maintained and how women were treated in the context of property versus being an equal partner in the context of a marriage and that type of thing. But they had to begin to they pushed a bipolar narrative to Phyllis Schaffler talked about this. And she began to say, we're the most blessed women. She's talked about this in the 50s and the 60s. We're the most blessed women ever in the face of the earth, Phyllis Schaffler said. And they're just trying to tell you that you're not. And so women became to get dissatisfied with the peak of being what other nations would consider a queen in regards, not king, but queen, of that it was all the availabilities and things that were there and everything. And so they pushed this bipolar narrative that you're dissatisfied. They got so much more. I mean, you got, and all of a sudden your family's not, you're just a mother. You just are managing your family's life and home. And all of a sudden she became dissatisfied. Not all, but some. And all of a sudden that's when you saw, but there was a dilemma with that. The dilemma with that was that no matter what, you still are a lady and you still can get pregnant and you still got to have your child. And so all of a sudden what happens? Sanger. They loose this whole Alinsky children folks, loose the birth control pill to be able to break loose from that kind of control. You are not going to determine whether I'll make the decision of whether or not I'm going to have a child or not. And then that didn't work. So then they begin push the narrative, and Sanger's motives were evil motives, trying to eliminate part of the citizenry of America based on that's what they wanted to do. But that didn't work, because then they pushed another polar narrative was, that children in your body are not children. And so all of a sudden they push the polar narrative and saying that all of a sudden this baby who you once cherished in your womb is no longer a baby anymore. And so people bought into that. And it's bipolar because it is a child. And everybody's finding out now how much it is. Even the very one that they use. What's the lady's name that they use in Roe versus Wade?
Norma McCoy.
I mean, she's right now, she's on television talking about, I was used, I was naive, I didn't realize, that type of thing. And she never had an abortion.
3 daughters.
Yeah. And so, but they pushed a polarized negative of the truth. And so what happened was, all of a sudden, it was okay to kill your children. And they utilized with, but it was called Woman Magazine. I guess it was at the time. I can't think of it. Ms. Magazine, because there was a lady in New York that had bought into the lie for whatever reason, and she took a hanger and she pulled her baby out of her womb, and she died in the hotel. Well, they took a picture of her cradled up. Tragic death. But see, that's what happens when we buy. That's all of us. That's where we'll all end up when we buy the polar narrative. They push a polar narrative. They're trying to push us out of the will of God. And then they took that and they ran with it. We're talking about the 12th tactic, and the tactic is the price for success. The price for a successful attack is a constructive alternative. In other words, when we're talking about this journey of how abortion got here, there was an alternative like, okay, your life, the bipolar narrative that was being pushed of women in the 50s was, your life it's going nowhere. Look at you. There's so much inside of you. You can be, that girl. You can be Wonder Woman. You can, bring home the bacon, fry it up in the pan. This whole, and it says she started feeling like, no, that was being pushed, like, I'm missing something.
Right.
I'm missing something. And so then she began to look different outside of what she presently had. In the context of that, some, not all, because many women were going like, you're going to mess this up.
Right.
You can watch it. And I have these interviews.
Sit
I'm
down.
not talking about what I heard from someone else say. I'm actually watching these ladies talk. Like, what are you doing? And now, of course, anyway, so they put, and this what happens is there has to be some sort of for the price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. That's what we're talking about. And so there was okay, if she's going to be that woman and that girl, for example, then we have to give her an alternative. Let's give her a birth control pill. Then it's like, okay, that's not going to work because you can still get pregnant with a birth control pill because the sexual revolution came and all that. And so all these children were happening, and they said, okay, now let's just give her another bipolar negative. Let's just push narrative. Let's just push abortion. The kid's that's not even a child. It's not even a child anymore. And finally with Ms. Magazine, when they had that one lady that had the self-abortion supposedly in the hotel, was tragic. They took a picture of her and stuck her in Ms. Magazine, and they ran with it. And they tried to use the romper room teacher, who did romper room for all of us old folks out there. I see Bobby. And she actually took a particular medication that caused her child to be deformed. And they ran to her trying to use her as the tool to be able to take but she went to another country, and there was medicines that were taken that I think we probably took crack at that time. So, we didn't know things. And she had an abortion different state, but she wouldn't let that take place. But finally they found
Norma
McCorvey, and they were looking for her, trying to be able to do that. They needed an alternative. They were trying to push the narrative because they wanted to take this blessed lady, this American woman, out of her blessing and bring her to a place that she would be the quickest, most fastest statistical place of poverty. The quickest way for a lady to be in poverty is for her to end up being divorced and a single mother. That's what statistics say.
That's right.
And took her out of this blessed place and now has her in this other place. And now what's happening? The government's kept stepping in and saying, now we're going to take care of you. But what happened when the family was taken? It was done in the family, but now, and this is what was going on, that all of a sudden in the 60s, women started saying to their husbands, wives started saying to their husbands, listen, I'll stay with you, but I want a contract, 50-50. And they started making contracts with their husbands.
Oh, wow.
And so its marriage was just ripped apart. The blessing that women had at that time in America was just walked right out of it. Why? Because a bipolar narrative was spoken, because you have to have a constructive alternative. So the alternative was to push this negative thing, call what was positive negative, what is good bad, and call what is bad is good. And all of a sudden you leave the good and you walk into the bad thinking it's going to be good, and you find yourself all alone, all on Prozac, all blaming all these men, because they say 72% of the people surveyed in America said the issue is with America is the father's absence. It's like he was there before everybody bought into this narrative in the 50s and the 60s, and all of a sudden he became some, weird thing. And so I'm saying that for say this. And so what do we have? We have now a law that says that you can kill your child. But it was originally just a narrative. It was a bipolar narrative that we bought into, and then we made it a law. We have a bipolar laws now on the books. And so when you see the healthcare bill, for example, that's crashing and it's not happening, which my heart breaks for you if you're counting on that to work, because you really thought you bought into this pushed bipolar narrative. But you have to understand, it's an impossible narrative. It doesn't even work. If already when your child was born, your child owes $50,000 in debt, and we haven't begun to even pay for this thing yet, it doesn't work. It's not that this whole thing needs to be rethought. I mean, maybe, God's doing by force what the church wouldn't do by choice, but understand this, that just because we need it doesn't mean it's going to happen. And so, like I said, my heart just breaks for you, because it was a beautiful narrative. It was true, but it's just wisdom and logic and just common sense. When you begin, and now we're seeing it unfold, it's just not there. But when you are one of Alinsky's children, it doesn't matter. All you needed was a constructive alternative. That's all you needed. When the birth control pill didn't work, let's go straight into abortion. When marriage didn't work, let's go into contracts. When this doesn't work, we'll go in. It's just like, it just always got to have another constructive alternative. So you're thinking, did I just really hear Nancy Pelosi say, we haven't read the bill yet, but we're going to get it in, then we're going to read it? You have to understand, she's not an ignorant woman. She's a smart woman. She understands what she's doing. She's a politician, but it's part of Alinsky's model. You just need an alternative. You got to get the ball moving. You got to get the ball rolling. You got to get the case in the courtroom so you can start saying eventually, I was for it before I was against it type stuff. Right. And so you're thinking now, and people who don't understand these tactics they're going, now look. It's like, no, you don't understand. This puppy's still moving. This whole thing's still going in a dark direction. We are being organized, and it's not by folks who you think it is, and it's definitely not, and we knew this from the very beginning at this conversation, but it unfolded as we talked about it, that our president has been set up in the context of this based on what God's revealed to us. That's all we have in the context of that. Now evidence is rolled out as we're looking at it, that people were meeting and saying, we got to choose who we're going to select, who's going to have a transformational presidency. And they hadn't yet decided yet. And it was between Hillary, and it was between Senator Barack Obama, and it was between Jonathan Edwards. They hadn't decided yet what they were going to do. And so when you start seeing this whole narrative walked out, that our president, who you need to pray for, and you need to honor, and you need to pray for his wife and his children, and if you want to have a peaceful life, understand that he did not, there's no way that he put that whole narrative together. It was the people that selected him to put the narrative together. I mean, think about how beautiful the narrative was in riding Lincoln's train, the same route that Lincoln rode all the way from Illinois to Washington, D.C. Come on. That is just like beautiful. That is like beautiful. It's like, did you see this? Did you see? That's like, I mean, and it's like when you get, and by the way, and God took me into the White House before. And I was there. And what happens when you win an office like that? You're so blown out from winning the process. You just try to show up and catch your breath, and say, okay, now what are we going to do first? Right. But when the narrative's already written for you, when you've already been selected, then they're walking out this whole orchestrated thing for you. And so that was beautiful. A train ride for the president who signed the Emancipation Proclamation for the first African American president. And the White House is like, oh, this is just amazing. And then to go all the way down to Mississippi to that particular college where they wouldn't even let an African American go to college, to be there to talk about part of his accepting of his office and everything, the but you know, sad to say that the high place that was what they selected as well. We talked about that already. But the narrative was being walked out saying, you know, that finally, you know, what so many people had given their life for has come to pass. Now the question is, well, where's the health care? You know, where's the promises? Are you organizing me? Did you use me? Did you use my family? Did you use my legitimate narrative?
Right.
Did the people who selected you, did they just use our blood, our sweat, our tears? Were we just prostituted? Think about that. You know, and it's like, that's exactly what Lucifer does. But you know what? Many are the plans in a man's heart, but it's God's plans that prevail. And no matter what men do, understand that if God's people stand up and unite and say, God, here we are, if we turn from our wicked ways, then God will hear from heaven and heal our land, and things can still turn. And I can't help but say, that is so cool to have Rosa Parks' statue sitting in the rotunda.
Rotunda, yeah.
That's so beautiful to have Dr. King's statue being there, although they had to change, they put other words under him. Yeah,
they changed it, put a prideful quote on the side of his statue, but they removed it.
But it wasn't him. He didn't say that.
It was not him. He did not say that.
People are trying to use what this man gave his life for. Understand, and it is the price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. And we're talking about the progression of the most blessed woman on the face of the earth during the time of the 50s and what was going on, and how things have got to the point where they are now. But in the context of that, this is how much the polarized negative, and I'm going to get back to that, has been pushed in regards to how beautiful women are and how important they are, and the polarized narrative towards men and how important men are, that now you have women not wanting to be women and men not wanting to be men. They're not happy with themselves. And I was watching just this last week or something like that. This program is called X Factor, and they had a beautiful young lady sitting there. She's obviously a singer or something, and the judges panel, and one of the men was singing. You sing, they sing or something, and he says, he calls her a woman, and she looks at him and she says, "This is a young lady." She says, "Don't you ever, ever, ever call me a woman again." And it's like, I mean, there's men that are like, please call me a man. You know?
Hello.
But I mean, here we go. The whole world's like, and there was two things going on. I'm sure that she was probably, you know, saying on her behalf is that the way you said it was condescending. But you need to say, you know, you don't be condescending versus don't put down yourself as a woman.
Right. Because
you're fearfully and you're wonderfully made. The enemy has convinced you that you're not a man, that you're not okay. It has convinced you that you're not a woman. That's called a pushed, polarized narrative. It's the opposite of what God's created you to be. I mean, it's happening in every aspect of our lives. And if you don't feel whole, you're going to begin to venture out into to explore the bipolar narrative of the right side. You're going to go into the dark side. And now we have this young, beautiful lady, and she's probably, I would say she's a singer or something, but she's young. She has to be like in her 20s. She says, for the whole world, don't you ever call me a woman again. And what man would go, maybe it is, don't you ever call me a man again. And it's like, what happened? We've bought so much into this. Being called a man or a woman is a negative thing. And so we got to be careful, because that's what's happening right now with Christianity, is that all of a sudden being called a Christian, the bipolar push, the bipolar narrative is it's a negative thing to be called a Christian. And it's like, you better watch out, because the other side of that is followers of Lucifer. And so this is standard Lucifer 101. It's been happening since, but you have to pay attention, because today, since we got to know the light side of this dark argument, that we can easily be organized into some sort of, I don't know, ghetto train camp oven shower thing, you know what I'm saying? And it's like it appears what's going on. And as we're speaking, it's reported by the Blaze that George Soros is coming in to the country on October 21st and going to present a quote conservative viewpoint. And that's another aspect that's been negative, polarized narrative, is because now, according to one of these organizations that call themselves conservatives, that they're calling Christians, I guess, talking to them, and they said that they would prefer to be called conservative than Christian. And it's like, hey, you've bought into the polarization. What you mean is you're a conservative person. You're not a Christian.
Right.
That's what you mean.
Right.
And that's what's happening. They just buy into that narrative, and before you know it, you're off the charts.
Yes.
But you keep pushing it and pushing and pushing. That's why you see all these stigmas. You see all this bashing.
Mm-hmm.
They just recently, Luke Russert, a host for, I believe it was MSNBC, was saying that the media is so biased towards Christians. It's just, you're seeing it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So now they get that narrative on the airwaves. They get that narrative in print. They get that narrative in sitcoms and on television.
Mm-hmm.
And now people are saying, well, maybe I don't want to be identified as a Christian. Really? You're willing to deny Christ?
And it's so important to understand that. So when you're looking at what's happening, you're buying too much into the constructive alternative.
Mm-hmm.
You need to go back and get your roots and the truth and forget about the alternatives, because they're just trying to create some that's why they didn't read the bill. It is irrelevant in Alinsky's tactics. You don't need to read the bill. You just need an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
They're not surprised that it didn't work. But the law was passed. That they passed laws that says that's all that needed to happen. Just Roe versus Wade passed. Great. Okay, let's move on. In a couple of years, that'll be by law, and you'll worry about it, and babies can get killed. I mean, all they want is just push the thing, the context of it. And when that law got passed, that was very significant. That was like a January 1973 Roe versus Wade moment in the context of it. Everybody just kind of winks at it. And it's like, hey, this is serious. But understand the light argument to this, the light side of this, the other viewpoint. When you think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he was the light side. He was the light in America, the light of God in America, when he stood up and said, that y'all are pushing a polarized negative that says that we are not human beings, that we're only 1/5 of a person, and that we don't deserve any rights. You're wrong. That's a polarized negative you're pushing, Lucifer, against us, the fellow citizens of America. And he stood up for what was right against the pushed polarized negative. And he was on the light side of the argument, not the right side. He was on the light side, which is the right side when you're on God's side. And he stood up for what was right against this lying Lucifer organized effort that was kind of trying to persecute the African American citizens in our country. And so you have to understand, but he had to know what was the light side of the argument. He had to understand it. And he stood up. If you read his 10 commandments to walk with him, he not only knew of the light, he knew the light. The light of God was inside of him. I mean, he walked. I mean, you had to know. The first commitment was you had to actually know Jesus and spend time with Jesus. And Jesus, by the way, is the light that came into the world, that is the life of all men. And if you receive Jesus, you receive the light. And that's what I'm talking about. He carried light.
Mm-hmm.
And so he stood up in the context of the Constitution. He stood up in the context of the light himself. And he pushed against this bipolar narrative that was saying that African American folks are not like folks like everyone else, and they don't. And he says that's not true. I'm only holding you what's written on the paper. And when he did that, God backed him up, and it brought us to the place that our original founding fathers wrote in the Constitution that we're supposed to have been all along, because the Bill of Rights is the Bill of Civil Rights for all of us. Every one of us deserve those rights. Everyone that's here. And so our rights come from God, and they wrote about them in the Constitution. And so you're talking about this. Well, so the question is, well, what do you do when they have these constructive alternatives? Well, you got to find out what the right side is. You got to find out what the light side is. You got to get in the Word of God. You got to start hanging out with light people who walk in the light. You got to pray together. You got to seek God and say, what's happening here? Because I think the narrative of wanting to make sure every person's medical needs taken care of is a light narrative. But the methodology and the way that they're going about it is a dark narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And since they're not going to be able to provide it, they're just using that narrative. The price of a successful attack to be organized is a constructive alternative. In every single way, when you look at the Jews and the way they were treated, oh, we're just trying to help you. We've constructed you your own place because now that people are talking bad about you, want to hurt you, we have your own community. It's in the future it'll be called a ghetto, but we're not going to call it that now. And we're going to bring you into this ghetto. And then after you buy into that alternative, it's going to go, now we have another area. We're going to concentrate you into another area. But you got to first buy into that narrative. And it's like, if you just stop following darkness and allowing darkness to organize you, and that's what Alinsky's children are doing. Whatever they do, listen, if you know them by their fruit, and people can do whatever they want to. This is not a political conversation. This is a church conversation. That's who we're talking to. If my people, God says, who call by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from our wicked ways, our stuff that we've done wrong, our dark stuff, and say, God, forgive us. God, we've done this. We're the one that brought this. He says, then I'll hear from heaven and I'll heal their land. And these other folks who are organizers of the night, they'll just have to line up with the day, because the day will begin to organize America again. Because there was a day, the day organized this country, when God truly was placed as the Lord of this country. And darkness is creeping in because it's in the heart of God's people. Listen, this 11th tactic can be counteracted by finding out what your roots are in the light. So when this constructive alternatives come up and they're dark alternatives, you can easily know what a lie is, because you know the truth. If you know the truth, then you know what a lie is. But if you don't even know what the truth is, how do you know when they're lying to you? And by the way, if they want to deceive you, they're going to give you a real pretty lie, a lie that benefits you in some way, some lie that makes you feel like you got a future when you really don't, some lie that they personally don't even know why they're probably telling you, but Lucifer knows why, because the end of it's not good. Steal, kill, and destroy. That's Lucifer's techniques in the context of that. And so the 12th tactic, the way we defeat it, the only way you can defeat it is through humility, which means you are in the light. You're in the truth. You're getting in the Word of God. You're abiding with God. And so when weird things happen like this that make no logical sense, your spirit man goes, this is one of Alinsky's children. This is Korah's rebellion. Oh, that's Absalom. He's obviously trying to take over his father's. That's, you just know. You just know. You just know. They got to have a constructive alternative, because you as a human being are creating the image and the likeness of God, and they have to get you to buy into it, and it has to make sense to you. And once it makes sense to you, even if it's the Tower of Babel, when you start buying into it, guess what? Hello, Nazi party. We were just talking about how John really enjoys watching the X Factor.
Yeah.
It was amazing to watch that they are worship leaders from churches that are there.
Yeah.
And they're wanting, this worldly father to recognize them, and they're almost in tears if he says anything positive about them. And then all of a sudden, because they're thinking, he's going to mold me and he's going to shape me. He's like, what happened to God?
Exactly.
What happened to God? It's like, but the church, where's the church? To me, it looks like the church.
Yeah.
In the context of that. And but I won't talk about John's favorite show. But isn't that an interesting tactic? Doesn't it make sense when you think about the healthcare bill? You think you're not going to read it, but you're going to pass it. It's like all they needed to have a successful attack was to have a creative alternative. That was it. So you're always notice there's always an alternative. There's always something else. And it's all, and understand that's the enemy trying to get you out of a right place. You got to find out. Don't just start getting in your car driving somewhere. Don't all of a sudden leave your marriage. Don't all of a sudden leave your job. Don't all of a sudden, leave your beliefs. Get into the Word of God and find out what God says about that before you start making any moves, because there's a reason why Lucifer is called the deceiver.
Mm-hmm.
And deception is this: when you think what you're doing is right, when you're wrong. And John G. Lake writes in his John. I'll tell you, Fear of the Lord.
John Bevere.
John Bevere writes in his book about deception, and he says it really. I mean, I've seen it happen in the context of it, but it's true. He writes this. He says, "The longer you are deceived, the thicker the veil gets. The harder it is to talk to someone." So deception is not something you play with, because you have to understand. At some point, you can that veil can get so thick on you that you can no longer. It just doesn't. Your brain can't see anymore. You can't think right anymore. And the devil, it's a spiritual deception cloud. Even the very elect could be deceived. Great deception is going to come. And so the way to be able to defeat that particular tactic is to get in the light. Because Jesus said, or Paul's writing to the church of Corinth, he says that their minds are blinded by the god of this world, the deceiver. When he's talking about the unbeliever, it's like, okay, if us as believers, then we got to make sure that we don't get our minds blinded. You know, forget about putting a blindfold over your eyes. You can actually walk around seeing with your eyes, but your mind can be totally blind. And if we have an undiscipled church, think about it. And we're not reading the Bible. We say it all the time because you're supposed to read it. People gave their life. I mean, it's just amazing what God did to make sure you can get it. And, my goodness, wake up, church. Wake up, get in the Word, stop all the distractions, and focus. Focus and realize that this is serious stuff. When you hear one of Alinsky's children, George Soros, who happens to be made, I don't know, 100-something, 300-something million dollars in a couple hours, whatever it was, because of the fall of a nation, and he's coming to convince your representative. So you understand when this is what they're reporting, is that he's flying in conservatives. He's funding the group to be able to fly in. By the way, which Zuckerberg he's an investor with Facebook. And so you got Zuckerberg and George Soros, and hang on. Listen, you're going to be if you're looking at the right hand, it's the left hand that's really something's going on over here. But the thing about it, don't look at either hands. Don't look at either hands. Look into the Word of God and look up. You know, and if you haven't yet you got to get the teaching. You know, facing impossible odds with God brings possible victories from your adversary. And there's a key, there's a strategy, there's a thing. Understand, this is all happening because of the church, what God's people have allowed in our lives. But we can unallow that. We can begin to say, I'm sorry, God, and turn back to God. But when you have, George Soros coming in on October the 21st, I believe it says, to talk to the Congress about amnesty, you have to understand that is you. That's your representatives. That's why it's called representative government. So what you do is you have George coming in to talk to you. The problem is you're not going to be there. The second problem is your representatives seldom represent you anymore. You know, that there's very few, and the few that do, they actually persecute those guys who actually stand up to go back to their communities, and they're getting a round of applause in their communities, but in Washington, D.C., they persecute the guys. So George is coming to talk to you, about your future, about your borders, about amnesty, about the what's happening right now, and our borders have been flooded. This whole thing's been set up, by the way, reportedly, and I don't know how much time we have left in the context of it. It's all happening like clockwork. But I do know this: we've been preaching to a lot of people who thought they had no need of nothing. When we were trying to say, no, but you're poor, naked, and blind.
That's right.
And I think we're about to find out. Everybody's going to find out where we're at. And understand this: what we've seen is the greatest harvest that we've ever seen. Just a huge harvest of people running to God that you're not even going to have to even articulate and finish. You know, sort of like the Brownsville revival, that people were ready to come. All that Steve had to do was itch his nose and say, come, you know. And, every night they would just come because God was drawing them to himself. And so God's about to draw a people to himself like never before. And we've just been preparing. That's what we've been doing, is preparing. And the question was, when God was showing me this vision, The question was, well, can we absorb this? And of course, in the middle of that, I thought, who cares? Come, and then he showed us more and more of what's happening. And these stadiums that you see everywhere that are playing ball games in today, well, I got news for you. According to a prophetic word given by John Paul Jackson, the NFL is going to be stuck. They're not going to know what to do because of what's about to happen. So you're going to have all these stadiums just waiting for what? For the church to gather. And all of a sudden, they're just filled. Buildings, listen, it's so outside of you and your building. God's not out of his mind. He's just out of your mind.
Right.
He wants to redeem the earth, the people on the earth. And so the stadiums are going to be filled with men and women crying out to God, this roaring, church that's just crying out, and it's going to polarize. It's not going to polarize. It's going to saturate neighborhoods and communities, and the church is going to rise up, and it's going to be the spirit of Elijah just preparing the way for the Lord as he comes. I'm telling you that you're about to enter into a season of the church has never even pondered before how awesome it's going to be. And understand this, with it, you're going to have all these organizers of the dark, organizers of the night. Don't worry about that, because you're a child of the day. You are already sitting in the heavenly realm with the Creator. You're already sitting with Christ in the heavenly realm. Your body just hadn't caught up yet. Listen, we've already won this thing already if you stay faithful to God. You've already won it. Now it's time to walk out the light. Be the light of the world. He's commanded us to be the light of the world. Listen, these stadiums today that are filled with NFL football players and these stadiums that are filled with baseball players are going to be filled with people crying out to God.
Amen.
Because the buildings will not be able to contain the harvest, and the church is going to have to arise and begin to be the church that he's trained us up and launched us out to be. These are exciting, exciting days that are unfolding on the face of the earth. And what we tell you is we've been preparing for some time now as the church sleeps.
Be sure to subscribe and press alert to get new notifications of new success secrets made available on VFN TV.
A lot of people want to abide with the Lord, but they just don't have a plan to do it. You can request that plan today at iabide.org.
I'm your host, Greg Lancaster, and we're so glad that you've joined us. Don't forget you can join us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Download our app and sign up for our newsletter, The Torch,
At VFNKB.com.
I've enjoyed our time together. God bless.